So now we're going to look at picking technique a lot more closely. I previously brought up the idea of different possible ways you can hold the pick and how it's really not too critical exactly which one you choose, but personally I choose the one where the thumbnail goes right over the middle of the pick. We'll get into some more techniques. So the basic process, as I mentioned, is ensuring that you are kind of pulling upwards using the sliding motion to make the picking sound. And even with going back and forth, even though you are moving up and down, it's not practical to have the string be, forcibly moved up and down. So each time you hit it, you're using a kind of a loose enough grip on the pick so that it can slightly move. So if you hold the pick firmly, it wouldn't allow that to happen. It would just so that's why with a looser grip, not loose enough to let it actually move kind of out of your fingers, but loose enough that, as you can see, it kind of bends within the position you're holding it in your fingers. So whether you do it that way or by going up, should get the same result. So once you got that out of the way, moving on to palm muting will help you understand a bit more of the options you have available for what it really means to hit a string or hit a note. So essentially you're just keeping your hand, not really the palm, you don't do that. That'd be a literal palm muting. But by just keeping the soft part of your hand right there, that ensures that the string is stopped from vibrating right over here. And it's interesting because it doesn't make that much of a difference exactly how far your palm holds up and down the string. It's important to make sure it's not all the way to the right, because then it's only partly muted. What you're really doing from a technical level is you're reducing the amount of harmonics that the string can make, meaning you're just getting more of the fundamental frequency of the string. You're just having the whole string all the way across the guitar, making big waves, the entire size of the string, and then a couple smaller variations of that. Whereas if you just play an open note, there's so many possible ways it can vibrate. It's not just the entire strings vibrating, but you also have all these little vibrations, all the harmonics, all the repeated frequencies that are just higher copies of the first one. And so by palm muting, you're cutting off the ability to do that, because you can't do the higher frequencies, higher wavelengths right over there. Now I know this isn't a science course, so I won't bore you with more details, but point being, it's important to block something. What's interesting is this kind of forces you into a bit of an angle, which is actually the way that I end up picking most notes anyway, even though you could approach notes completely parallel, where the pick is exactly parallel to the string. In practice, I usually end up going slightly at an angle. Now there's not really any advantage in going fully diagonal, but as long as you have the right grip, then you don't have to worry about actually, hitting the string awkwardly, because even at that angle, you can still kind of smoothly glide it. But that's not what we're here for. What we're here for is knowing that you can hit at an angle if you have your hand forced into that position over here. You'll notice I did slightly move my palm over if I do actually want to palm mute up here, which is less common. So what you're doing there is only partly muting it. So if you hold the palm up here, then you're more likely to actually be completely muting the string once you play it. What you're doing is just making it harder for it to ring out all the way, depending on exactly where you locate it. So once you get the hang of that, it's important to practice a little bit faster to the point where it's just a habit of putting your hand in that one place and then putting all of your energy on actually making the repetitive motion with your fingers now that you have this in the right place. I'm going to skip ahead to tremolo picking, which is another defining feature of some types of metal. In principle, it really just means picking as fast as you can, but using some technique is of course ideal. So if you approach it just from the idea of trying to vibrate your hand, it can get a little messy because you're no longer doing that thing where you're gliding. So let's break that down into what are you doing anyway when you are playing rapidly. You'll see that there are actually a few different things you could be moving to make the rapid motion. One would be just the tips of the fingers, where you're keeping your wrist in exactly the same place and just moving fingers. The other would be more of the wrist motion, where it's held in place at the joint but doing this motion. Doing this sort of forces this part of your thumb to be a little tenser and kind of vibrating almost. The other is almost just with your whole arm, you're kind of just doing everything. So if you see, this is actually going up and down as well. And so when you are playing long sets, long songs, it may be helpful to use a combination of all of those. It may sound a little silly just demonstrating it this way. In a song, you might have a more consistent pattern of exactly how you're doing it, following a tempo. Let's say that you start off with something that's more strumming or just alternating up and down picking, but they need to go double the speed. Well, without necessarily trying to stay on time, you can just make sure that you're going fast. And if it's mixed in with bass and drums and everything, it's almost a way of getting out of having to do it perfectly. On the other hand, if you use it more as a technique of that being the thing that's shining, it's kind of the lead part, then you actually are trying to go as fast as you can. So it is an interesting balance there, choosing whether you are trying to play with a perfect technique versus using tremolo picking as its own texture. Because honestly, even though a lot of parts might be really simple, you might just have a few notes played on top of a lot heavier other guitar and bass and drums. But if you are playing that as tremolo picking, it can give it a lot heavier sound, just because it's really forcing the note out there. It's not just passively playing in the background. It gives it more of a sense of urgency. Combining that with palm muting becomes an integral part of a lot of metal technique, because it may be a little less common to actually hear it played out as, you know, full measures. The idea of palm muting and doing that quick technique is an integral part of a lot of music. As you can see, the line between a rapidly picked note, like a 16th or 32nd note, and tremolo picking can sometimes be pretty blurry. You know, that's sort of just a messier play style when you're just sort of jamming your hand into the strings. When ideally you are following 30-second notes or whatever, if that were possible. In practice, you're often just kind of shaking your hand. So I would start off with the two versions. One would be the controlled, and then just trying to do that double speed. And also practicing of just seeing if you can go as fast as you can. And then over time, at least in my experience, I kind of was able to merge those two into just one pattern where necessary. So then depending on what I'm playing will affect my actual approach or my actual technique, whether I'm just doing it as, you know, kind of squeezing my arm almost. It's not really flexing, more seizing, I think is the word. So you're almost locking your arm from being able to move beyond just a vibration. It just can only stay in this one place. I'm kind of exaggerating it visually for the video, but it's sort of like when you know, try and hold your head in one place or hold your leg in one place, but then you force it to vibrate. It's able to move faster than if you actually just try and, oh, I'm going to move my whole arm now. You know, I use all my muscles in my arm to move it. No, you try and just force it to stay, but then allow it to vibrate. As opposed to the other method, which of course is go in a controlled way. Ultimately, they could end up being sort of similar in your approach. So that right there, it probably has a real name of the kind of the triplet. Not triplet, but playing the three notes back to back to back. Become a feature of a lot of music. Now, especially with that technique, with the three notes back to back to back, playing that, especially palm muted, especially on higher strings, I do have that more angled diagonal approach. Because you don't have the luxury of being able to do if you are palm muting also. You know, you can't really do that. You have to force yourself to approach from the side. So there's a lot you can practice from those techniques. You could simply practice jumping from palm muting to an open note. Because then that ends up being an important part in a lot of riffs where the palm muted note stays lower and the open note is higher. It's played with more variation on the fretboard. And especially combining on multiple strings, you palm mute on the lower ones, pick on the higher ones without palm muting. So from there you can just use the exercise of any one of those exercises as a practice, and then ideally try and do something with your left hand on the ones that are not palm muted. And finally, pinch harmonics are one of those sort of embellishments that are a good way of either showing off or just forcing the attention to be on the guitar for a second because the pitch is so much higher. So they are a bit tricky to master, especially on higher up strings. I'll just look at with the lower couple strings on what you're really doing. So before getting into different ways of changing the tone with the left hand, we'll just use it completely open. So what you're really doing is making sure that you're slightly hitting the string after you pick it with this part of your thumb right there, just barely. And that is the tricky part, is making sure you're only barely hitting it, because if you completely push down on the string again, you'll just mute it. And if you miss it, then you just end up playing the note. So doing it just right, first off, with the pick, you're kind of breaking some of the technique that I talked about earlier about not just pushing the string, because in this I really do push the string a little bit. And then after pushing in one fluid motion, the thumb should be directly above the string, just barely hitting it, and then let go. As you can see, even just where you put it and the variation in how high can affect whether you actually hit it or miss, and if it's a different pitch. So in my opinion, the harmonics aren't very good with just open, when there's no fret being played. I think playing on the 5th fret is probably the best one for a lot of them. What's funny is the note itself doesn't really sound that good if you really think about it. What it really is just a limited form of the note that would otherwise be played. But because it's going through such a high gain processing, then it kind of amplifies that and forces it to still have that almost distorted sound instead of just the high pitch. And so because the sound isn't really that good, the way you can make it sound like it is, or still keep the attention on it, is to kind of aggressively be bending the string with your left hand. So it can do the same thing. It sounds a lot different. Especially when it suddenly shows up in a song like that. So pay attention to how the sound is a lot different from just playing by itself versus with a lot of bending. And as you can see, it can be tricky to suddenly jump to that, especially from palm muting. So that's certainly something to practice, getting the motion back. You're in one position, you're forced into one position for palm muting, and you're forced into another for harmonics. So it's kind of a jump. so ideally make sure that you are not in a ultra palm mute focused stance or a separate harmonic stance for another, even when you're not planning on doing that transition, I mean just by default. So that way it's not as awkward when you do have to switch what kind of picking you're doing. And it's just a slight rotation almost of the arm. Whereas everything from your wrist down to your fingers stays kind of the same and you're just moving the arm. So I'll take a look at a couple other techniques that are more advanced in theory, in musicianship. Obviously playing really fast tremolo notes or palm muting and complex time signature, that can be challenging by itself, but as far as the actual thing that's being done, it's a straightforward motion once you can train with muscle memory on how to do it. So something trickier would be, let's say, double picking on multiple strings. What I mean by that is double picking of, if you treat that as the repeating unit of measure, just a down pick and an up pick, then it can be tricky to do that on multiple strings, because if you go from this note to this note on the next string, you can't just do down pick, up pick, down pick, up pick, because then you're having a weird jump. Now of course you can, because what I did there is I just kind of keep jumping up and up and up. But you're not doing the same thing as what you're doing if you just stay on one string, where I can go a lot faster that way. It's a lot harder to do that on multiple strings, because as you can see I keep having to jump up each time I change strings. So for that I would start with up picking and then down.